A crime like no other. The fallout from the actions of one man is
one of pure evil.
We had grenades, which had not happened before in that sort of attack.
a dispute between two families that ends with a father and son being brutally murdered.
I've never come across anybody who could be so callous and so cold.
A man on the run that sparks an international search and drives a community to be silent.
£50,000.
Culminating in a hoax call to police.
Someone just threw a big concrete slab through my back window and ran off.
That lures two young women to their deaths.
And he didn't actually say the words, but he just said there's no easy way of saying it.
We're just ordinary people. We are just ordinary people.
I'll be waiting.
The calculated murders of 4 people and one of the largest ever manhunts in the country to catch the ruthless killer makes this a crime that shook Britain.
Police emergency.
Someone just threw a big concrete slab through my back window and ran off.
The 18th of September 2012. Greater Manchester Police receive an emergency call to attend an address in Hattersley.
What's the address there, please?
Abbey Gardens, Mottram.
From what appears to be a routine incident, 2 local officers, PC Fiona Bone and PC Nicola Hughes, finished their morning briefing and are tasked with going to the address just 3 miles away.
The day had started with me coming into work and going through all of the risk assessments and the incidents overnight, just to make sure that we hadn't missed anything and that any intelligence opportunities had been taken.
For just over 5 months, officers at the force have been on high alert, trying to track down a man who has murdered in cold blood and gone on the run.
It was a huge investigation. We had huge numbers of people here carrying out that investigation. Clearly, I'm not going to go into all the various tactics that were used, except that Cregan at that point was identified as a national threat.
Local criminal Dale Cregan has evaded police now for 5 weeks after murdering a father in broad daylight.
We did the risk assessments, and then we were pretty confident that things were moving as best as they could with the information and the intelligence that we had.
We had armed officers from other parts of the country, but what we clearly couldn't do is just abandon normal policing, and nor would it have been right to do.
As the desperate search for this fugitive continues, the day gets underway and more calls from the public come in. Meanwhile, Fiona and Nicola arrive at Abbey Gardens in Hattersley.
I was chairing the meeting and we were discussing just various things around police in the division. There was no knock on the door just literally burst open, and one of the detectives from the CID, or from the investigative teams within Tameside, was stood at the door, and he just said, "Boss, you better come out, there's something happening at Hyde." And he didn't really know what it was, and I didn't know what it was, but you could see that there was something significant. And he said, "I think it's Cregan." And I turned the radio on, hoping that this was just real positive news. I mean, in my mind, I was thinking this is good news, you know, that we've caught him or he's handed himself in or whatever. The police radio took just a few seconds to fire into life, and as it did, the words that came over the radio, I'll never forget. And it was one of the sergeants who was saying, "They're shot. They're shot. Get an ambulance. Get an ambulance."
As the divisional commander tries to process the information coming through the radio, the situation quickly develops.
I remember thinking that just doesn't make sense. And the radio came on, I heard the radio operator at the same time trying to call a call sign of Golf Mike 41, Golf Mike 41, which was Nicola and Fiona's call sign. Because the call taker had obviously realised that those officers had gone to an address in that area, but I don't think had made the link at that point, and I certainly hadn't made the link. So I recall literally picking up my mobile phone and ringing the duty inspector.
As Chief Superintendent Adderley rushes to clarify what has happened, he receives news he will never forget.
But the phone was answered by the sergeant who'd been on the radio, and I remember saying, "What's going on?" And he just said, "She's dead. She's dead." And I remember trying to speak to him and saying, "Who's dead?" And the phone went off. And I rang the phone back immediately, and it was the inspector this time that answered the phone, and he said, "Fiona's dead, and we're working on Nicola now."
The brutal and sustained attack on two defenceless young officers marks the devastating end to a reign of terror that began 6 months previously.
It started from two families with a long history. It started off from a dispute between those two families, but a dispute which had a long history of animosity as well.
The two warring families are both notorious names within East Manchester.
Often, perhaps, the public isn't fully aware of how actually a lot of crime is generated by crime groups who create the market in stolen goods, create the market in drugs, who get involved in all forms of illegal activity through their power bases, through their threats, through their intimidation, through their reputation. Will try and rule areas, intimidate areas, and almost try and create an alternative economy and an alternative, almost criminal justice system.
Both families have a long history of animosity and reputations within their communities. But despite this, nobody could predict what is to unfold.
It started from a dispute over a woman and an argument over a woman.
If somebody had made an advance towards somebody, that person had not taken them up on that particular offer, that was seen as disrespect. And we do believe that she allegedly had said she was going to get the boys to sort this out.
A friend of one of the families ends up in a physical argument with a female rival who has many allies. "12 days later, at the Cotton Tree pub in Droylsden in Manchester, 23-year-old Mark Short is drinking with his friends and his dad, David. Just before closing time, a masked gunman enters the pub. Mark Short and 3 of his friends are targeted with a hail of bullets as other customers look on in disbelief.
I remember quite distinctly it had been a long day, and I'd driven home, and I'd literally arrived home when the phone rang to say that there'd been a murder.
The 25th of May 2012, and a young father has been brutally murdered in a public house after a heated argument between two families 12 days earlier. And 3 of his friends lie critically injured after a gunman opened fire in front of stunned onlookers.
Because they're talking about people that were in criminal associations that were largely the witnesses, who did not want to speak to the police, where clearly steps had been taken to obviously cover the tracks of those who had committed the attack, and that it was a very, very difficult investigation.
As Mark Short's family try to process the brutal attack, rumours begin to circulate that the young father of one was not the killer's intended target, and names of those allegedly responsible are beginning to emerge.
It got to the stage where people were identified as being responsible, including Dale Cregan.
31-year-old Dale Cregan is a criminal from Droylsden, Manchester, with a very distinct appearance. He has one eye, maintaining a rumour that he lost his other during a vicious fight in Thailand.
Well, Cregan was known to the police anyway. He has a long criminal history, so he was well known to us.
It was not top of the pile, so there was quite a lot of intelligence about him, and clearly these two families were very well known about, but on the whole, It wasn't particularly active or particularly high on the radar.
Cregan is arrested at Manchester Airport as he arrives back in the UK after a trip to Thailand. Police suspect that if he is the culprit, that he has not worked alone. And with the network of suspects increasing, they must also be mindful of any reprisals.
We were always very worried that there could be further attacks. The sort of challenges we had was clearly, number one, finding the people responsible, people who are highly skilled in covering their tracks, who will have a wide web of associates who will protect them. We then had a huge number of people who were potentially at threat because we didn't know who next within the criminal associations would then be targeted. So there was an enormously difficult situation of literally hundreds of people on both sides of this dispute who are now at risk, who had to be warned about their risk, and in certain situations had to be protected.
What began as a small-scale dispute is now turning into one of Greater Manchester Police's largest investigations. And the line of inquiry involving Cregan is about to present a challenge.
We couldn't at that point get sufficient evidence together, which would have then enabled the Crown Prosecution Service to have then charged them. And that is why they were then let out on bail. And that is, whether we like it or not, a common occurrence.
A young man lies dead, and tensions around his local town of Droylsden are running high. Cregan is released, but weeks later, two of his associates, 27-year-old Luke Livesey from Hattersley and 38-year-old Damien Gorman from Glossop, are arrested and charged with murder and 3 attempted murders. But as officers press on their suspects in custody, another shock is in store. Clayton, Manchester. Mark Short's father, David, is outside his home unloading a vehicle. It's just over 10 weeks since his son was shot dead. Now, 2 men with weapons attacked the unsuspecting 43-year-old in broad daylight.
Once the second murder occurred, we then realised that we had some significant issues that we had to deal with very, very quickly.
David Short is chased through his house as he tries to flee from the gunman, but he has nowhere to hide. As he lies dying, his attacker doesn't stop there.
Sadly, we are not unfamiliar with gangland-type murders, and often with these murders, it is gang members shooting each other using traditional or conventional firearms. The difference with this one was the use of hand grenades.
The use of military grenades is not something the force has seen before, and is a weapon that causes significant destruction. As officers hunt for the ruthless killer, evidence from this attack and from the murder of Mark Short seems to be pointing very firmly to one man, Dale Cregan, along with certain associates.
In terms of how we got him and linked him to these offences, it was through forensics. First of all, how we actually got the link there. But secondly, there was an incident moments after he'd murdered David Short. Literally moments after, he went to an address in Luke Road and was caught on CCTV with, we believe, the firearm that he used to kill David Short. And the CCTV footage also caught him taking the pin out of the grenade and throwing it at an address in Luke Road.
A shocking, violent attack on a man who has no chance of defending himself. Officers now have 2 murders to solve.
What started off as this, supposed disrespect for a woman, then had escalated, to people being shot in the pub, and then to grenades being used. It was an extremely unusual and clearly violent event, and particularly, the use of grenades created huge challenges for us.
It was a very complex investigation because we now had somebody that we knew was on the loose. We knew that he was capable of using hand grenades, which had never been seen before in mainland UK. He was not afraid to kill, murder, maim.
This cold-blooded attack sparks a nationwide manhunt. The police are all too aware that this could trigger more violence and they have a killer on the loose with access to very deadly weapons.
With advice from the military, we knew that they had a kill range of 50 metres and a maiming range of 100 metres. Potentially, we still had these hand grenades possibly in Cregan's possession, and we'd seen the level of violence that he was prepared to use. My fear was you throw one of these grenades into a public house, into a nightclub, into a police carrier, you have killed everybody. It was the level of weaponry that was now available and on the streets of Manchester, which was frightening, and I have to say kept me awake at night.
Cregan at that point was identified as a national threat, but in terms of getting national coverage, part of the challenge we had was that at that time it was the Olympics, so all the media focus was on the Olympics, quite understandably.
Suspecting that the same man is responsible for 2 murders and has the use of such destructive weapons, the police come up with an unprecedented tactic to try to catch him.
The first reward discussed was £25,000. I recognised pretty quickly that £25,000 would not be enough to surrender this individual, I think mainly because of the fear that was in the community. The reward was actually up to £50,000. I remember having the conversation saying, you're going to have to do something which is unprecedented too in terms of reward. This is going to have to be life-changing. Let's say it's £1 million. Because I remember my officers coming in and saying that they were taking down posters in and around the Droylsden area saying that if you grass to the police, you will not live long enough to spend £50,000.
The murder of 2 men gunned down in cold blood has sparked a nationwide alert for the #1 suspect, Dale Cregan. And having used not only guns, but also hand grenades in his last attack, the police are in a race against time to try to catch him before he strikes again. In an unconventional move, they decide to offer a reward for any help.
If you think about the cost of the investigation to that point, and you now think about the cost in terms of lives and everything else that followed, then £1 million to me was small beer. The posters that were being put up was indicative of the kind of fear that existed within that community, so we had to do something which was pretty unique.
The decision ultimately is that £1 million is an excess, who's now gone on the run and vanished off the radar.
Now the threat had escalated to an incredible proportion that we had over 100 people that we considered now to be at risk because of the links with these gangs. Over 100 people that we considered were going to be the next target.
A reward is on offer, but a community are remaining silent. What started as an argument in a pub now potentially involves hundreds of people. As more officers are drafted in, another of Cregan's accomplices, 24-year-old Jermaine Ward, is charged with David Short's murder, as police continue to press on those closest to their main suspect in the hope of hunting him down.
There was a lot of pressure put on various associates, family members. Clearly there was a huge number of rumours circulating. There was material on social media. Even to this day, there are people who will tell you that they knew where he was. We know that's untrue. It does show clearly that if you are determined to evade the police, if you are pretty skilled in some of those evasion techniques because of your previous criminal history, because of what you've been able to pick up about police tactics each time when you were arrested and convicted, because material is disclosed to you in the court process, then clearly that is an enormous challenge for policing and for law enforcement in general. Clearly we've examined a lot of our tactics since. We've developed some new tactics.
I think when it hit home quite how serious this was looking around and seeing Dale Cregan, his face, that very memorable image now on billboards that the police need to find this man.
Although there have been a number of arrests over the months, their main target is nowhere to be found. The hunt focuses on Cregan and another man, Anthony Wilkinson. Wilkinson is a 33-year-old associate of Cregan's from Beswick, Manchester.
He was on the run with Anthony Wilkinson. We knew that he had a number of people that had assisted him in the preparation of this crime and committing crimes. And so we had all of those individuals that we were looking for as well.
Despite hundreds of officers across the country being pulled in to try to track the pair down and the search extending across the UK and into Europe, the two wanted men evade the police. Until weeks later, in a shock move, one of them hands himself in.
It was fair to say that after Anthony Wilkinson surrendered himself to custody, that Cregan was the main player. He was the one that we feared would create the most problems for the communities and would create most problems for us.
Wilkinson takes the decision to surrender peacefully to officers, leaving one very dangerous man at large.
We've been under huge pressure. You know, it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We put into place a number of measures in terms of trying to quantify the risk. We had a lot more armed officers. We had armed officers from other parts of the country. But what we clearly couldn't do is just abandon normal policing.
Dale Cregan has been missing for 5 weeks, when the emergency services receive a call from a member of the public complaining about damage to his property.
Someone just threw a big concrete slab through me back window and ran off.
Were you in the room where it came through, or did you hear the bang?
No, I was upstairs. I looked out the window and seen one boy running off.
Is it a kitchen window that's gone through?
Yeah, kitchen.
Believing this to be a genuine call for help, local police constables Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes are asked to go to the caller's aid.
They'll try and get up there as soon as, if there's a possibility he's still knocking about.
All right then, thanks very much.
Okay.
I'll wait. I'll be waiting.
Fiona was obviously the first, and she knocked on the door, and we do know that Cregan opened the door and immediately began firing this Glock 9mm weapon at Fiona and Nicola. No words were exchanged. He just simply started firing with this extended magazine on this weapon.
Fiona has a taser gun that she courageously tries to deploy, but Cregan shows no mercy on either woman. They don't stand a chance. After the sustained attack, he flees in a vehicle and, in a bizarre move, drives to the local police station and gives himself up.
We've then got Cregan, who'd obviously driven to Hyde police station and had handed himself in. Did he have hand grenades on him? Was that police station now going to get blown up with hand grenades? Was the vehicle that he was in, was that booby-trapped with these grenades? Did he still have the weapon on him?
As officers rush to contain the murderer, the enormity of the situation is taking hold. Tragically, Fiona loses her life at the scene, whilst people do everything they can to try to save her colleague Nicola.
I've got one officer that an inspector is telling me is dead. I've got another officer that they're saying is working on, that was Nicola. What did working on mean? It seemed I was just stood there forever, and almost as if I was looking down on the situation. And I feel in a way quite annoyed at myself about that, because you would think that you would know what to do. But I've said this many a time, we're just ordinary people. We are just ordinary people.
Nicola is rushed to hospital, but her injuries are extensive.
We were driving home and then a phone call came up, and it was an unknown number on my hands-free in the car. And it was this, a DCI from Manchester. And he said, I need to speak to you. And then I could sense in his voice there was something, and I said, why, what's happening? He says, where are you? I said, I'm driving home from work. I'd seen Nicola the night before, and I thought she said to me, I'm off for 5 days now. But she said, I'm on for 5 days now. Obviously, I misheard it. He said, where are you? I'll come and get you, I'll come and get you. And he said, you know, there's no easy way of saying it. And he didn't actually say the words, but he just said there's no easy way of saying it. And then the next, 2 or 3 miles were, I don't know, a blur, a nightmare.
23-year-old Nicola Hughes loses her life in hospital, despite desperate attempts to save her.
I was at work, and the phone rang, and it was Bryn ringing me. I realised that it said, Nat, Nicky's dead. And it's that kind of thing where the room feels like it's spinning and it just takes your breath away.
And as Nicola's family are told of the devastating news, officers rush to locate Fiona's parents, almost 150 miles away on the Isle of Man.
We were sitting having lunch and we put the news on, and the headlines were 2 police women had been killed in Manchester. And fairly vague, but hey, Fiona's police woman in Manchester. Oh, should I give her a ring, should I not? And then there was a knock on the door. And that was it. So I opened the door to a police sergeant and a nice young police lady and said, you may as well come in then.
We'd called all of the team back in off the streets, and they were all sat in the canteen at Ashton Police Station. And we walked into the canteen, and they were all sat there. And you know, as you can imagine, you could have heard a pin drop. And we had to obviously give the news and the devastation that created. That they just then to be informed that they'd lost 2 of their colleagues on, you know, what had been just a call to a routine burglary or damage. Just the level of grief in that room was palpable. And then, of course, you've got to offer them the support. Clearly, they couldn't go back onto the streets.
Gradually, the horrific news starts to make the headlines across the country as everyone tries to absorb the magnitude of what has happened.
It's difficult to describe how you feel. Obviously, if you're feeling numb, you're feeling shocked, you're feeling anger, you name it, every emotion you could think of is going through your head. I think she's so easygoing. I think that was one of the massive qualities, that she was really easygoing. She was so wise, she was intelligent, witty. She liked the job itself. She hated the cold, she hated the wet, and she didn't like the shifts. She liked the excitement of the police, and she enjoyed what she did. She enjoyed helping people.
She moved to Manchester, where she became a special. And she enjoyed being a special 3 or 4 nights a week, or whatever it was she did. And she really liked it. So from the special, she tried joining the police force, and eventually she did. She liked it. Anything that was a bit risky, dodgy, or could upset anyone wasn't told to us. We only got to hear the good bits.
Nobody could have predicted the sequence of events that has unfolded.
I'll be waiting.
Innocent officers murdered on a routine patrol, the first such incident to involve 2 female officers. And while the shock sinks in, investigators discover another disturbing element. Not only has Cregan ambushed innocent officers, but he's also taken a family hostage in their own home and used this as a base from where he made the hoax call.
Cregan held these people hostage with threat of murdering them and blowing up the daughter and all the rest of it. He allowed the occupant to go to work that morning, but had threatened to kill his partner and child if he had called the police.
A 23-year-old Nicola Hughes and 32-year-old Fiona Bone have been shot in a calculated and ruthless attack. What police believed to be a routine call turned out to be an ambush by a callous murderer they'd been hunting for months. And despite trying to evade officers during his 42 days on the run, Dale Cregan turns himself into police after holding a terrified family hostage in their own home since the night before.
I've got every sympathy with the occupant of that house, because I know what we could have done and how we would have reacted. He doesn't know that, and he would have to have that level of confidence that we could have neutralised that threat without harm coming to his child or his partner, and he didn't have that, so that was difficult.
Astonishingly, Cregan switches between normal conversation and deathly threats to the occupants whilst brandishing his weapons, before hatching his plan to call police the next day and lure unsuspecting officers to their deaths.
Cregan reportedly had said he was sorry that it was women and he wished it had been men. I want to make the point that Cregan saw those officers walking towards that address and had a number of opportunities not to engage with those officers. And if you look at Nicola, who was 23 at the time, who just looks like a child, and Fiona, who was 5 foot nothing, you could see that these were two individuals that actually were not going to pose much of a threat to him in any case. So this business about wishing that it had been men is nonsense.
If it hadn't been Nicola and Fiona, it'd have been somebody else. Nicola wasn't normally crewed with Fiona, so that was purely random. And it was just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time.
Another reminder of the incredible risks and the great work our police service does.
The loss of both women brings the nation to a standstill, as their families and the police force have the harrowing task of preparing for their funerals.
And my thoughts, and I think the thoughts of the whole country, will be with their families at this impossibly difficult time.
Do you expect your children to plan your funeral? You don't expect to plan your own children's funeral. So it was really strange.
We had to get this right for the families of Nicola and Fiona, and for Nicola and Fiona, we had to get that right. It was emotionally and physically draining. And I often make the point, you know, that we are very well trained within the police. And you think that that will carry you through, and it just doesn't. It just doesn't.
2 weeks on from the murders, Manchester stands still as colleagues, friends and members of the public line the streets to pay their respects firstly to Nicola.
I mean, it was a horrendous occasion for me, but support we had leading up to it and then on the day, it made you soaked it up, you soaked the energy up from people. Even though it was a sad occasion, obviously.
It felt like the country stopped. Certainly Manchester came to a stop. And I can't tell you what it meant for our officers, just the, number one, the enormous support from our colleagues.
The following day, thousands of people pay their respects once more and say goodbye to Fiona.
We were taken to Manchester Cathedral a few days earlier just to see what the cathedral looked like and meet the principal people conducting the service. And we thought, how are you going to fill this place? It's vast. And that came as quite a shock. The sheer number of people when you got outside the cathedral and all those people standing, bowing their heads, was amazingly humbling.
As the tragic loss of the two young women sinks in, the enormity of the situation weighs heavily on their colleagues' shoulders.
I think one of the things for me was I felt so responsible for their deaths, and still do. And so responsible to the community. I remember not going home on some days, because if something else happened, I would have to be there to explain why that was. We always have a plan. There's always a way through this. We'll sort this out. And then suddenly after the funerals, I remember sitting there and thinking, you've no plan. You know, you try to reassure the public that you can keep them safe and look after them, and yet I was unable to do that for my own. And I remember meeting with the Chief Constable and having the conversation and saying that I've got to go. I have to resign.
The divisional commander's decision to leave is met with strong opposition from the Chief Constable, who urges him to reconsider.
I just couldn't get up in the morning. It had gone for me.
The Chief Superintendent decides to stick with the force, but as he, along with the rest of Fiona and Nicola's colleagues, struggle with their loss, the legalities must continue. The case against Dale Cregan and his associates is prepared for court.
Cregan gave himself up. He didn't want to be killed. And then there was an enormous investigation, and people may think, well, that's easy. You know, it's obviously him that did it. But you then obviously have to prove the whole sequence. We had to try and find out where he had been, who had sheltered him, who had supported him, all the other criminal associates that had been involved in the case. So there was an enormous investigation.
The authorities are taking no chances when Cregan's trial begins. A convoy of police vehicles escorts the suspect to the court each day, and the level of security is unprecedented.
It was a different category of trials in that armed officers were around the court, they were on the roofs of buildings, and it made it clear how much of a threat the police believed this man to be.
The highly charged trial starts with the number one suspect pleading not guilty to any of the 4 murders.
There was this fear, of course, that he might get off with it. So in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yes, he could be found not guilty. In terms of safety on the streets of Greater Manchester and Tameside, what would that mean?
We were in the second week of the trial before we heard that Dale Cregan was to change his plea to guilty for the murders of PC Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone.
Cregan also admits to murdering Mark and David Short. Weeks into the trial, the court catches a glimpse into the mind of this killer.
Dale Cregan said that he murdered PC Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone because during the course of that manhunt, his family had been hounded by the police, and that this, the culmination of the manhunt, was the way he'd exact his revenge. The police had to find this man. They knew how dangerous he was, but they couldn't have anticipated 2 unarmed female officers with no way of defending themselves against a man with a gun and a grenade.
And that level of danger becomes evident once more when during the proceedings officers raid an address and discover a further 10 grenades belonging to Cregan. After a trial lasting 19 weeks, Dale Cregan is found guilty of murdering Mark and David Short, Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes.
He was sentenced to a whole life tariff, which in itself is unusual. It's not something that we always see.
Similar sentences are given to the other men arrested and charged over the months. Luke Livesey and Damien Gorman receive life in prison for murdering Mark Short and the attempted murder of 3 of his friends. Jermaine Ward and Anthony Wilkinson are found guilty and sent to jail for life for their part in the murder of David Short. The sentence handed down to Cregan for murdering the officers can never be enough.
The families of Nicola and Fiona and colleagues will never see their, their loved ones again, and so almost nothing can compensate for that.
If you take someone's life, then you deserve, for the rest of your life, you're incarcerated, you're locked up, and that's what I think. If I focused on that person, it eats away. It's like taking poison up in yourself, and up in there dying. They don't.
With the verdict through, everyone is left to cope with their grief. Cregan's disregard for the law continues, with rumours of him smuggling drugs and a telephone inside the prison. But despite this, lasting legacies are formed in Fiona and Nicola's names.
You've got 2 choices in there. You can either give up, you can either go and hide yourself away, or you can carry on. You can pull yourself, and I know what Nicola said. She said, pull yourself together, carry on, get up and do something. I needed something as a challenge for myself, and there was 3 charities that helped us in the early stages, and I wanted to give them something back. So I thought I'd run a marathon for that, and then my wife was talking, and we said, well, why don't we establish our own charity in Nicola's name?
In March 2014, the Nicola Hughes Memorial Fund is established to give support and skills to young people who've suffered a tragic loss.
So we thought, well, yeah, we'll do things to help them practical-wise. We'll pay for driving lessons for them, we'll pay for school shoes, because, let's face it, if Dad's murdered, family incomes, it could be gone, could be wiped out.
But the loss of Nicola affects others differently.
I think Bryn and I started to pull in different directions because he was setting up the charity and that was really positive for him. But that, for me, was just a continual reminder of what had happened.
The charity becomes a formidable force, with Bryn achieving feats such as a marathon at the North Pole to raise money and awareness.
I've sort of realised how positive setting up the charity's been for Bryn, and I focus on that now. And whilst I still can't be involved in the element of it that's about Nicola, I try to be more involved in the kind of logistical things and like social media and things like that.
And a lasting tribute is also paid to Fiona. The building of an assisted living complex in her name.
When we found out, we said, yes, that's a wonderful thing, and they invited us across to lay the foundation stone. Fiona would have enjoyed Fiona Gardens. She did Duke of Edinburgh's Gold Award as a care assistant in a care home on the Isle of Man. Fiona's a very down-to-earth person. You know, she had a commendation, she didn't mention it at all. You know, that was Fiona. It's something I've done. Move on.
It's kind of a middle ground now, I think, between being able to remember really positively but still it destroying you when you kind of remember what happened. Being around her was just a pleasure. She was just one of the nicest people you could imagine.
I think you've just got to remember the good times. You can't dwell on the bad. You can't do anything about the person who's died. In the evening, we'd possibly ring each other, and I really miss those phones. It was incredibly hard not to do it. And I was finding myself in tears going along bits of road for no apparent reasons, you know. I really do miss Fiona. Yeah, and nobody to play with anymore, and nobody to take me out drinking when they shouldn't, and things like that.
I still remember us laughing her head off and you know, being friendly and practical jokes and jumping on me when she sees me and everything else. So that's how I remember Nicola.
4 lives needlessly lost and families torn apart through the devastating actions of a few. I'm Dermot Murnaghan. Join me next time for more Crimes That Shook Britain.
More all-new Crimes That Shook Britain next Sunday at 9. Tonight, it's the big one, marking the 20th anniversary of O.J. Simpson's acquittal next with The Secret Tapes, the first of 2 new exclusive specials here on CI, taking you inside the civil trial tomorrow night, more unseen recordings at 10 in O.J. Speaks, The Hidden Tapes.